The Galactic Preparatory Institute on Station Kepler 9 existed in that peculiar space where idealism met bureaucracy and promptly got its teeth kicked in. Established roughly 200 standard cycles ago by the Interspecies Educational Concordat, because apparently someone thought throwing adolescents from 47 different species into enclosed spaces and calling it learning was a brilliant idea. The station orbited a dying red dwarf that had seen better millennia. The architecture was all sweeping curves and translucent alloys, the kind of design that screamed we're enlightened and progressive, while quietly installing reinforced bulkheads every 20 meters because, well, teenagers. The Institute prided itself on fostering unity, understanding, and mutual respect among the galaxy's future leaders, diplomats, and assorted troublemakers whose parents had enough credits or political clout to enroll them. In practice, it was a microcosm of galactic politics. The strong species looked down on the weak, the technologically advanced mocked the primitive, and everyone agreed that humans were peculiar mammals who'd somehow stumbled into space travel despite having all the physical advantages of particularly ambitious potatoes. Humans had only been part of the galactic community for 70 standard years, barely a blip in civilizations that measured their histories in epochs. And they carried that newcomer stench like cheap cologne. Sure, they were innovative and scrappy and had that amusing never-say-die attitude, but their physical specifications were laughable compared to proper warrior races. No natural armor, no venom sacs, no enhanced musculature that could snap durasteel like kindling. They weren't even particularly good at the intellectual pursuits that let physically weak species compensate. They were just sort of there, filling their admissions quota and providing comic relief. Room 47B, officially designated as Combat Theory and Tactical Response, because calling it Introduction to Not Dying Horribly in a Fight was apparently too honest. Embodied everything both wonderful and terrible about interspecies education. The chamber was circular, about 40 meters in diameter, with a reinforced practice floor that could withstand Class 3 explosive impacts. Tiered seating rose along the walls where students from 24 species sat, segregated by atmospheric requirements and social cliques that would make mean girls weep with envy. Professor Karl Rex, a Torgothi with 6 manipulator limbs and compound eyes that caught every angle of mischief, presided over the controlled chaos with the weary patience of someone who'd seen everything and was thoroughly unimpressed by all of it. The Torgothi were natural educators, possessing both the multitasking capability and the thick exoskeleton necessary to survive proximity to hormonal students who could accidentally level buildings. Today's lesson focused on species-specific combat advantages, which was academic speak for let's catalog all the ways you're naturally designed to murder each other, so you can appreciate why interspecies warfare is generally frowned upon. The practical demonstrations were usually controlled, supervised, and about as dangerous as a particularly aggressive pillow fight. Usually, Vexithor dominated the front row with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never encountered consequences. He was Krillithian, and if you'd asked Central Casting to provide one stereotypical reptilian warrior species, they'd have sent him with a bow. 2.4 meters of scales, muscle, and barely contained aggression. The Krillithians had spent the last 6 centuries conquering or intimidating everyone within 3 sectors. Their homeworld was a high-gravity nightmare of megafauna and active volcanism, producing warriors who could bench-press small vehicles and considered broken bones a light workout. Vexthor's scales carried that deep emerald iridescence that marked warrior-caste Krillithians, and his spine ridge was studded with the decorative piercings that advertised 17 documented combat victories. At the Institute, he'd cultivated a reputation as untouchable, partially because his father was a high commander in the Krillithian Expeditionary Fleet, but mostly because he could casually toss most other students across the room and his species' diplomatic standing meant actual consequences were negotiable. He held court among the handful of other apex predator species. A Vrexian whose forearms could strike from angles that violated geometry. A Horthak whose armored hide could stop plasma rounds. And assorted hangers-on who'd calculated that proximity to power beat standing on principle. They lounged in their seats with the particular sprawl of young beings who'd never experienced an honest ass-kicking and assumed the universe was their personal playground. Another riveting discussion of theoretical scenarios we'll never encounter, Vexthor announced to his entourage, not bothering to lower his voice, because why would he? I'm sure the dissertation on Peluvian poison adaptation will prove invaluable when I'm commanding fleets. Professor Kalrex's compound eyes swiveled in his direction with the mechanical precision of targeting systems. Cadet Vexthor, if you've achieved such mastery that instruction proves redundant, perhaps you'd prefer to demonstrate your comprehensive understanding practically? The Krolithian's smile revealed teeth designed for rending. Gladly, Professor. What did you have in mind? 7 rows back, tucked into the mid-tier seating where the unremarkable species congregated. Mackenzie Torres watched the exchange with the expression of someone observing paint dry in real time. At 1.7 meters and 68 kilograms, Mac represented baseline human specifications with the kind of deliberate averageness that made people's attention slide right past. Brown hair pulled into a functional ponytail, standard institute jumpsuit without modifications, sitting posture that suggested neither confidence nor fear. Just existing in space. She'd been at the institute for 8 months, maintaining grades in the 75th percentile across all subjects. Not exceptional enough to draw attention, not poor enough to require intervention. She participated in class discussions with measured frequency, turned in assignments on time, and had exactly 3 friends from compatible species who appreciated that she neither dominated conversations nor required constant validation. What most observers missed, and most observers missed pretty much everything when it came to Mac, were the details, the way her eyes tracked movement with the precision of acquisition software. How her hands, currently folded on her datapad, bore the faint calluses of someone intimately familiar with impact training. The fact that while everyone else watched Vexthor's preening, she was calculating sight lines, identifying exits, and cataloging which students would panic versus which might actually help in an emergency. Mac's family had history. Her grandmother had been part of Earth's first contact teams, back when humanity was still figuring out that the universe was significantly more crowded and significantly less friendly than the optimistic fiction had suggested. Her father had served in the Terran Defense Integration Corps, the polite name for the military units that handled situations where diplomacy had failed, and someone needed to explain humanity's position with kinetic emphasis. Her mother taught Krav Maga, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and what the family euphemistically called problem-solving methodology. Mac had been training since she could walk, not the recreational martial arts that suburban parents enrolled their kids in for confidence building, but the systematic study of human combat potential conducted by people who understood that Earth's one galactic export besides stubbornness was an evolutionary template forged in violence. Humans came from a death world, though that designation was still being argued in academic circles who couldn't quite process that Earth's classification as Class 7 hazardous meant humanity's baseline environment would hospitalize most species. But Mac kept that information filed under nobody's business. The Institute was supposed to be about education, networking, and building bridges between civilizations. She'd come here to study xenobiology and comparative cultural frameworks, not to validate her species through violence. There were enough humans already earning that reputation in less controlled environments. Since we're discussing species advantages, Professor Kalrex continued, mandibles clicking in what might have been amusement. Perhaps a practical demonstration would illuminate the theoretical concepts more effectively than my apparently tedious lectures. Vex Thor stood with the fluid grace of a predator who'd never questioned his place in the food chain. "I volunteer, Professor. And since we're demonstrating species-specific capabilities, perhaps we should include one of the more fragile specimens for contrast?" His gaze swept the classroom with theatrical deliberation before landing on Mac, with the precision of something rehearsed. The human, perhaps? It would be educational to demonstrate the vast gulf between warrior species and those who've survived through luck rather than capability. The classroom atmosphere shifted immediately. This was entertainment, drama, the kind of social violence that students across the galaxy recognized and eagerly consumed. Mac felt 46 pairs of eyes turned toward her, with varying degrees of curiosity, pity, and anticipation of schadenfreude. She looked up from her datapad with the expression of someone who'd been interrupted while reading something marginally more interesting. "Pass." "I insist," Vex Thor said, descending the tiers with heavy footfalls that emphasized his mass advantage. "Surely you're not afraid? This is merely educational demonstration. Controlled environment, safety protocols, all that tedious institutional liability protection." Professor Kalrex's compound eyes swiveled between them, internal calculations weighing institutional protocols against the political complications of either permitting or preventing this encounter. The Krolithian diplomatic mission had already lodged 17 complaints this cycle about their students being subjected to discriminatory treatment. Their definition of discrimination being anyone suggesting Vex Thor shouldn't do exactly what he wanted. Cadet Torres: "Participation in practical demonstrations is voluntary, but encouraged," the professor said carefully, threading diplomatic needles. "However, if both parties' consent and safety parameters are observed, such exercises do provide valuable experiential data." Mac closed her datapad with deliberate slowness. She could decline. Should decline. Walking away from obvious provocation was the smart play, the mature response, the choice that wouldn't complicate her academic trajectory with incident reports. But Vex Thor had been escalating for weeks. Comments in the corridor about human fragility. Casual shoulder checks that sent lighter students stumbling. Yesterday, he'd cornered a first-year human in the commissary and made her cry while explaining in elaborate detail exactly how his species had dominated their local cluster through strategic application of overwhelming force. And Mac was tired of watching it happen. "Sure," she said, standing with the enthusiasm of someone agreeing to attend a moderately boring lecture. "Why not?" The practice floor cleared as students recognized a quality drama approaching. Vex Thor strode to the center like he owned the space, rolling his massive shoulders and flexing his clawed hands in movements calculated to emphasize his physical advantages. 2.4 meters of apex predator confidence. Mac walked down the tiers at a measured pace, neither hurrying nor stalling. She stopped at regulation sparring distance, 3 meters that Vex Thor could close in approximately 1.2 seconds if he committed to a straight-line charge. She didn't stretch, didn't warm up, didn't perform any of the preparatory rituals that fighters use to settle nerves and center focus. "Safety protocols active," Professor Kalrex announced, manipulator limbs dancing across controls that raised a Class 4 kinetic barrier around the practice floor. First incapacitation or submission concludes the exercise. Medical team on standby. Lethal force is explicitly prohibited and will result in immediate intervention and criminal charges regardless of diplomatic status. That last part was directed at Vex Thor with a kind of pointed emphasis that suggested previous conversations had occurred. Rules of engagement. The professor continued. Natural biological capabilities only. No weapons, no technological augmentation. Striking is permitted. Grappling is permitted. Techniques targeting permanent injury are prohibited. Acknowledge understanding. Acknowledged, Vexthor said, his smile all teeth. Acknowledged, Mac said, her tone suggesting she was confirming the weather forecast. You may... Vexthor didn't wait for the completion of formal authorization. He closed the distance with the explosive acceleration of a high-gravity species, his right arm cocking back for a straight punch targeting Mac's center mass with enough force to crack ribs. It was dismissive violence, the kind of casual strike that said, "I don't even need technique for you." The blow landed with a sound like a percussion charge detonating. Mac stood exactly where she'd been. Vexthor's fist stopped against her raised forearm in a basic outside block that every first-year student learned in week 3. The impact should have sent her sliding backward, bones fracturing from kinetic transfer. Instead, she'd absorbed the force through structure and angles, redirecting energy into the floor. Vexthor's expression flickered. Confusion chasing surprise, chasing the first genuine emotion beyond arrogance Mac had seen from him. He pulled back and struck again, a combination now. Right, left, right, with the speed that made Krolithians dangerous. Each blow was designed to overwhelm, to break guard through simple repetition. Mac blocked, redirected, and sidestepped with minimal movement. Her blocks weren't meeting force with force, but deflecting at angles, using his momentum against him. Basic physics that apparently Krolithian combat doctrine overlooked in favor of just hitting harder. "Stop dancing," Vexthor snarled, genuine anger creeping into his voice. He lunged forward with a grab, meant to secure her in close quarters where his mass advantage would be decisive. Mac dropped her weight and pivoted, his grasping claws finding empty air. She was suddenly outside his reach, having covered 2 meters in the time it took him to process her absence. Not running, repositioning with the efficiency that marked someone who'd practiced movement 10,000 times. The classroom had gone silent. This wasn't how these demonstrations proceeded. The physically superior species dominated the physically inferior species. Everyone learned an object lesson about the natural order. And they moved on to the next topic. Humans weren't supposed to make Krolithians look clumsy. Vexthor reset his stance, reevaluating. His earlier dismissiveness evaporated, replaced by the focused aggression of a predator recognizing actual prey behavior. He began circling, looking for openings, fighting smart now instead of arrogant. Mac turned with him, maintaining distance and angles. Her expression hadn't changed, still that neutral observation, like she was watching someone else's sparring match. But her body positioning was textbook perfect. Weight distributed, hands up but relaxed, breathing controlled. Interesting defensive capabilities, Vexthor said, trying to regain social ground even as he lost tactical ground. But defense isn't victory. Eventually you'll tire. Your species lacks our endurance. Basic biology. Sure, Max said, the word containing entire essays on disagreement condensed into 4 letters. Vexthor feinted high and struck low, a sweep designed to take her legs out from under her. It was a good technique, well executed, the kind of move that won regional tournaments. Max saw it coming 3 movements before it arrived. She shifted her weight, lifted her front leg, and let his sweep pass underneath, while simultaneously dropping her elbow onto his extended leg with targeted precision. Not hard enough to break. Lethal force prohibition. But sufficient to hit the nerve cluster that made his entire limb go momentarily numb. Vexthor stumbled, more from surprise than damage, and Mac was already moving. She closed distance before he could recover, her right leg sweeping behind his supporting leg while her hands pushed his center mass. basic trip from any grappling manual, but executed with timing that turned basic into brutally effective. 2.4 meters of apex predator hit the practice floor hard enough to rattle equipment. The sound echoed through the sudden silence like artillery. Mac stepped back, resuming her neutral stance, giving him space to rise. Honorable. Professional. Infuriating. Vex Thor scrambled up, scales flushed darker with either exertion or humiliation. The mask of superiority had cracked, revealing something uglier underneath. Wounded pride wrapped around genuine rage. He'd stopped fighting for demonstration and started fighting to hurt. "You want to make this real?" he hissed, his voice dropping to the register that preceded Krolithian combat frenzy. "Fine. Let's discuss what happens when warrior species stop playing nice with prey." He attacked with genuine intent now. Combinations, flowing with practiced lethality. High, low, high, using his reach advantage. Incorporating feints that had been drilled into him since hatching. This was no longer sparring. This was a fight. And Vex Thor had been trained by military instructors from a civilization that had conquered star systems. Mac blocked, slipped, and redirected with increasing precision. She wasn't just defending anymore. She was reading him, predicting his patterns, seeing 3 moves ahead. Each of his strikes came closer to connecting, but never quite landing, like trying to hit smoke. And then she shifted gears. Mac's counter came between his attacks, a straight punch to his solar plexus that carried her full body weight behind it. Not particularly hard by Krolithian standards, but perfectly placed to drive air from his lungs. Before he could process it, she'd pivoted behind him, her legs sweeping his base, while her hands controlled his upper body. Vex Thor went down again, harder this time, and Mac followed him into the ground. This was where human evolution had crafted something special, where a species without claws or natural weapons had learned to weaponize position and leverage. She secured his back, one arm snaking around his throat in a rear naked choke that martial artists had perfected over centuries. It wasn't a blood choke. Those took seconds and created medical complications. This was an air choke, uncomfortable and controlling, but not immediately dangerous. Vex Thor thrashed, his superior strength meaning nothing because Mac had positioned her body mass to control his, had secured angles that turned his power against him. "Submit," she said quietly. The first word she'd spoken since the engagement began. Not a demand, just a statement of fact. Submit or pass out. Your choice. Vex Thor kept fighting, claws scraping at her arms, but finding no purchase through her jumpsuit's reinforced material. His legs kicked, his body bucked, every instinct screaming to break free. But Mac had made herself a weight he couldn't dislodge, had positioned her body to ride out his movements, and maintained that chokehold with the patience of someone who'd done this countless times. 20 seconds. 30. His movements weakened as oxygen deprivation began affecting motor control. His vision was probably tunneling now, panic overriding tactical thought. "Submit," Mac repeated, still calm, still controlled. "I yield." Vex Thor finally gasped, the words barely audible but carrying through the absolute silence that had enveloped the classroom. Mac released immediately, rolling away and standing in one fluid motion. She offered him a hand up. He slapped it away, stumbling to his feet under his own power, scales heaving with the effort of recovering his breath. Professor Kalrex's voice cut through the tension. Exercise concluded. Cadet Torres demonstrated effective utilization of leverage and positional dominance to overcome a significant physical disadvantage. Note the application of technique over raw force and the ability to secure submission without inflicting permanent injury. This is textbook combat efficiency. The classroom remained frozen. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. Humans didn't defeat Krolithians in physical combat. That violated the understood social hierarchy, the natural order that everyone pretended wasn't based on who could hurt who the worst. Mac walked back to her seat with the same measured pace she'd descended with, collected her datapad, and sat down. She didn't gloat, didn't acknowledge the stares, didn't perform any of the social rituals that usually accompanied victory. She just resumed existing in space like the previous 5 minutes hadn't fundamentally altered everyone's calculations. Vex Thor stood in the center of the practice floor, the physical manifestation of cognitive dissonance. His entire identity was built on Krolithian superiority, on physical dominance, on the assumption that warrior species occupied the top tier and everyone else existed to acknowledge that fact. Having that worldview systematically dismantled by someone from a species he dismissed as harmless was triggering something between existential crisis and homicidal rage. "Lucky," he spat, though even he didn't sound convinced. "You got lucky." Mac didn't respond. She was reading her datapad again, apparently engrossed in whatever material the previous lecture had covered. "I want a rematch," Vex Thor demanded, addressing Professor Cal Rex since Mac was clearly done paying attention to him. "Proper match, tournament rules, full contact." "Request noted and denied," the professor said, manipulator limbs already pulling up the incident report forms that this encounter would generate. The exercise achieved its educational objective. Further engagement serves no academic purpose and carries increased injury risk given demonstrated emotional investment. Translation: you got beat, accept it, we're moving on. But Vex Thor wasn't moving on. For the remainder of the session, he radiated barely contained violence, his attention fixed on Mac with the focus of someone plotting revenge. The other students gave him space, recognizing when a predator was wounded and consequently more dangerous. Mac, for her part, took notes on Professor Calrex's lecture about comparative anatomy and striking vulnerabilities across species. She asked one question about Peluvian nerve cluster distribution that was actually relevant to the coursework. She demonstrated absolutely zero awareness that she'd just become the most talked-about student in the institute. Class ended, students dispersing with the hurried energy of people eager to spread gossip. Mac packed her datapad, nodded to her 3 friends who were staring at her like she'd sprouted additional limbs, and headed for the exit. Vex Thor was waiting in the corridor, flanked by his usual entourage and looking like he'd spent the last hour deciding whether assault charges were worth the satisfaction. "This isn't over." "Okay," Max said, attempting to navigate around him. He shifted to block her path, using his size to intimidate. "You embarrassed me in front of the entire class. That requires response. Krolithian honor demands..." "Krolithian honor can take it up with station security," Mac interrupted, her tone still perfectly neutral. "You started that engagement. Professor Calrex has the footage, and I'm now late for xenobiology. If you want to continue this conversation, file a proper challenge through institutional channels. Otherwise, you're just blocking the hallway." She walked past him, not around, but past, her shoulder brushing his torso with the kind of casual disrespect that said your size isn't intimidating, it's just inconvenient. Vex Thor watched her go, his expression cycling through rage, confusion, and something that might have been the first genuine self-doubt he'd experienced in his life. The story spread through the institute like a virus through an unvaccinated population. By evening meal, every student had heard some version of events. The details got embellished with each retelling. Mac had thrown Vex Thor across the room, had broken 3 of his ribs, had made him cry and apologize. None of it was accurate. But accuracy was irrelevant compared to the narrative implications. A human had defeated a Krolithian in open combat. Not through technology or trickery or numbers, but through simple technical superiority. That changed calculations. If one human could do it, maybe others could. Maybe humanity's classification as non-threatening needed revision. Maybe those deathworld rumors weren't exaggerated propaganda. The Krolithian diplomatic mission filed a formal complaint within 6 hours, demanding Mac's expulsion for assault on a student whose father held significant military rank. The Institute's review board pulled the footage, watched Vex Thor throw the first strike, and denied the complaint with the kind of barely concealed satisfaction that suggested they'd been waiting for an excuse. 3 other species' diplomatic missions filed inquiries about human combat training methodologies. 2 offered immediate internship opportunities to Mac specifically. One asked if Earth would be interested in providing military instruction to their defense forces. Earth's diplomatic corps, recognizing both opportunity and crisis, issued a carefully worded statement about humanity's commitment to peaceful coexistence, while quietly not denying anything. They also sent Mac's family a classified message asking if they'd be willing to discuss consulting opportunities. Mac, blissfully unaware that she'd just altered interspecies political dynamics, spent the evening in her quarters studying for an upcoming xenobiology exam. Her 3 friends showed up with questions that weren't really questions. "So," Trevek said, a Pelusian whose species specialized in information brokering, "you've been holding out on us." "About what?" Mac asked, not looking up from her notes on reproductive strategies in methane-breathing species. "About being some kind of human super soldier?" "I'm not. I just paid attention during training." "Training that involved learning to choke out Krolithians?" "Training that involved learning principles, leverage, positioning, breathing control. Works on pretty much everyone with a circulatory system." Her other friend, Kal Shah, a Virithian with 4 eyes that provided 360 visual coverage, leaned forward. "You realize you're famous now? Like, station-wide famous?" "Great," Max said flatly. "Can I be unfamous? I liked it better when people ignored me." "That ship has departed the dock and achieved FTL," Trevek said. "Half the combat specialization students are trying to figure out your training regimen. The other half are insisting it was a fluke. Vex Thor's friends are making threats that sound serious, but probably aren't given institutional security protocols." Mac finally looked up from her notes. "Is this going to be a thing now? Because I really just want to study, pass my classes, and not become a symbol for interspecies anything." "Too late," Kalshaw said cheerfully. "You're a symbol. Embrace it." Mac groaned and returned to her xenobiology notes, though she had the sinking suspicion that her carefully maintained low profile had been permanently demolished. The next day's combat theory and tactical response class had triple the usual attendance. Students from other sections crammed into the observation areas, ostensibly there for legitimate academic cross-reference, but actually hoping for repeat entertainment. Vex Thor was absent. Turned out he'd filed for medical leave citing psychological distress from institutional persecution, which was Krolithian. "For I'm not going where people witness my defeat." Professor Kalrex addressed the elephant-sized interest in the room immediately. "Yesterday's practical demonstration has generated significant attention. For those requiring clarification, Cadet Torres utilized fundamental grappling principles that leverage technique and position over raw physical attributes. This is not revolutionary. These principles are well documented in multi-species combat studies. What is notable is their effective application by a species often underestimated in physical confrontation scenarios." Mac kept her head down, desperately wishing for a cloaking device. Multiple species employ similar methodologies. The professor continued, compound eyes scanning the crowd. The Virithian mantis hold, the Peluvian nerve lock, the Torgathy immobilization matrix. All examples of overcoming size disadvantages through technical precision. What we witnessed yesterday was simply a human variation on universal principles. Which was a very diplomatic way of saying, stop acting like this is unprecedented, everyone. But the attention didn't fade. For the next week, Mac found herself the unwilling center of an entirely unwanted spotlight. Students asked for demonstrations, instructors requested interviews, even the Institute's combat sports clubs tried recruiting her, despite her having zero interest in competitive fighting. Through it all, Mac maintained her carefully neutral existence. She attended classes, studied her coursework, and refused every invitation to capitalize on her sudden notoriety. When pressed about her training background, she provided non-answers that were technically truthful, but revealed nothing substantial. Eventually, as all things do when fresh drama inevitably replaces old drama, the attention faded. New students did new interesting things, scandals emerged and subsided, and life at the Institute returned to its baseline chaos. Vexithor transferred to a different section, then a different station entirely. Rumors suggested his father pulled strings to relocate him somewhere his humiliation wouldn't follow. The Krolithian diplomatic mission stopped filing complaints, but maintained a distinctly frosty relationship with human representatives. Mac's 3 friends became her buffer against continued curiosity, running interference when strangers approached with questions. Trevek started charging for verified information about the incident, building a small, profitable side business from Mac's reluctant fame. Kal Shah appointed herself Mac's unofficial bodyguard, despite Mac being demonstrably more capable of handling herself. The long-term impact was subtle but significant. Human students at the Institute walked differently afterward, carrying themselves with a quiet confidence that came from knowing they had capabilities others had underestimated. The casual dismissiveness from warrior species diminished, replaced by wary respect or, in some cases, studied avoidance. 6 months later, in a completely unrelated ethics course, Mac was paired with a Krolithian student for a joint project. The student, definitely not Vexithor, but clearly aware of the story, approached the partnership with the kind of careful respect usually reserved for handling live explosives. They worked together efficiently, turned in an excellent presentation, and at the end, the Krolithian student asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," Mac said, packing up her materials. "That incident with Vexithor. Did you know you'd win?" Mac considered the question carefully. "I knew I had training he didn't account for. I knew his assumptions about human capabilities were wrong. I knew if he threw the first strike, he'd committed to a fight he didn't understand. So, yes, I was confident in the outcome. And if you'd lost, then I'd have learned something about my limitations and adjusted my training accordingly. That's how you improve." The Krolithian nodded slowly, processing information that fundamentally didn't align with how his species approached combat. For Krolithians, losing was shameful, a mark of inadequacy. For Mac, it was apparently just data collection. "Your species is very strange," he finally said. "Yeah," Mac agreed. "We get that a lot." The Galactic Preparatory Institute continued its mission of fostering unity and understanding, though the curriculum now included significantly more emphasis on avoiding assumptions based on physical appearance. Professor Cal Rex updated the combat theory syllabus to explicitly address the dangers of underestimating opponents, citing recent events without naming specific students, but fooling absolutely nobody. Mac graduated 3 years later in the top 15% of her class, accepted a position with the Interspecies Medical Research Collaborative, and successfully avoided physical confrontation for her entire remaining academic career. She published 2 well-regarded papers on deathworld adaptations in carbon-based life forms, neither of which mentioned combat applications, but both of which were immediately classified by multiple species military intelligence agencies. Vex Thor never returned to the Institute. Last anyone heard, he'd accepted an administrative position in a peripheral Kralithian territory, far from the core worlds and further from anyone who remembered his embarrassing defeat. And somewhere in the Institute's archived footage, preserved for posterity and occasionally shown to new combat instructors as a teaching tool, was a perfect 3-minute demonstration of why you should never, ever assume you understand what a human is capable of, based on their appearance, their size, or their species' general reputation. Because humans came from a world that was actively trying to kill them every single day. They evolved in competition with creatures that could crush them, poison them, infect them, or eat them. They survived ice ages and plagues and predators by becoming the most stubbornly adaptable species their planet had ever produced. And sometimes, in the controlled environment of an educational institution, when someone pushed too hard and struck first, that evolutionary heritage showed up to teach its own lessons. Without mercy, but with perfect technical precision,